Mike Theo from the Realtors Association, Dale Beatty from the Wisconsin Farm Bureau Federation, Brandon Scholes from the Wisconsin Grocers Association, Eric Borgerding from the Wisconsin Hospital Association, Kurt Bauer from Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, and Tom Still from the Wisconsin Technology Council. So please thank all of the business leaders for writing their reports. And if you want to talk to them in person, they're here, so you can get it from the horse's mouth. So now on to our next speaker. She hails from South Haven, Michigan, on the other side of the pond. And I want to welcome economist Marcy Rossel. Marcy electrifies audiences nationwide, speaking on the nexus of economics, politics, culture, and the media. And she was best known as the lively chief economist for CNBC in the months immediately following September 11th. Prior to her career in broadcast journalism, Marcy served as corporate economist and investment spokesperson for Oppenheimer Funds, and of course, you know them as one of the nation's largest mutual fund companies. Before moving to Wall Street, she was an expert witness for Deloitte & Touche in court cases involving economic issues, and she began her career as an economist with the Fed in Dallas. And she earned a PhD in economics from SMU, where she was named one of the Young Alumni of the Year in 2002. So please welcome Marcy Rossel.
Thank you so much. Well, I have to say, it is not every day for me that I have a governor of a state as my warm-up band. That was pretty amazing. And what I'd like to do today is basically just give you the headline over the global economy. Because I always like to start that way. I always like to think of sort of a word for the year. And as we move into 2019, particularly the first quarter of 2019, I think the one headline, the one word that will sort of summarize everything that we're about to experience for the next 3 months is disruption. For the first quarter of 2019, I think the word disruption will characterize what we're likely to experience over the next 3 months. Now, for an economist, disruption really has two sides to it. So one of the things that, if you know me at all, you know I have twin daughters. My daughters are now 28, but when they were little, does anybody here have twins? Anybody have twins? Yeah, a lot of people do. They're not that unusual, right? But does everybody always ask you, which one is the evil twin? Right? And of course, I would always say, well, the evil twin, yep, I know exactly which one that one is, yep. So they all have an evil twin. And disruption is kind of the same way. Disruption has a good twin and an evil twin. So in economics, when we talk about disruption, frequently we talk about things like creative destruction, new technologies that come in and upend industries and change everything. And from an economic point of view, that type of disruption is positive. It's creative, and while it might destroy one industry, it tends to create another more high-valued industry. So that type of disruption is something that economists always think of as being very positive for the economy, the sort of thing that promotes economic development, that kind of creative disruption. But then there's disruption of the other kind. The disruption that can tend to cause negative economic consequences, the kind of disruption that tends to be behind economic downturns, slowdowns, maybe even recessions. And those disruptions tend to be unexpected events, typically man-made, typically policy-oriented, that may have negative short-term consequences. And I'm concerned that it is this type of disruption that will characterize the first quarter of 2019. So I need to talk to you today about what kind of disruptions I'm talking about. The first one we'll discuss is pretty far away from home, but it has immediate consequences for the global economy, particularly through exchange rates, and that is Brexit. So we're going to talk about Brexit first, the first sort of man-made disruption to the global economy that's having economic consequences even for you right here in Wisconsin. We're going to, of course, talk about the government shutdown. I checked on my phone right before I got up on stage, and apparently it's not over yet. right? But if it does end sometime while I'm talking, just somebody let me know, and we can just skip over that entirely, right? But that's sort of the second, really what I think I'll tell you right now. I think it's going to be a real short-term disruption, but again, it has genuine economic consequences that we can't overlook, and it's being spurred on by something that has economic consequences for the United States, mainly immigration policy. And I would be remiss if I didn't share with you my economic point of view on that issue. And then finally, we're going to talk about the third disruption, and that is the trade war that has engulfed the U.S. economy and China over the last 12 months. Again, a thoroughly man-made disruption to global economic activity, and I'll talk about the costs, benefits, and possible outcomes of all that for the first quarter of 2019 and then beyond. So let's talk first about Brexit. Now, we all know that Brexit's been around, and the vote happened in 2016. This thing's been lingering over the global economy for 2 years. But why is Brexit sort of front and center right now, and why do I believe it's having pretty severe economic consequences for stock markets worldwide, which didn't have exactly the best year last year, and currency markets, particularly the value of the U.S. dollar, which we've seen hang out at a pretty high rate, right? We've had sort of experienced this period of a strong U.S. dollar, and I believe that behind those things primarily is the prospect of a chaotic Brexit. So, 2016 was the year when the vote actually happened. But the reason that Brexit is sort of coming to the forefront right now, and I believe driving a lot of the uncertainty in the global economy, is that they have a deadline of coming up with the deal of March 29th, 2019. So, my friends, that is only a little more than 2 short months away that they have to come up with a very sort of complicated plan for Great Britain leaving the European Union. So they just got 2 months to do it, and it's been sort of, if you think politics in Wisconsin has been a little dicey and interesting over the last few months, you can't imagine what it's been like in Great Britain. So just be thankful that you're not there, because essentially, to sort of put this all in a nutshell, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, comes up with the plan. She presents it to the European Union, and they say, okay, fine, this will work for us. She takes it back to her legislature, her parliament, and they go, right? So basically, she can't get the 2 parties that need to agree on a plan for Britain exiting the European Union. And here's the sticking point. Essentially, just to sort of sum it all up, the leavers, the people who sort of voted for Brexit, basically want all the benefits of free trade with the European Union and none of the cost. They want the benefits of free trade with the Union, yet they don't want to take the cost, which is the free movement of people. They don't want the free movement of people, but they want the free movement of goods and services and capital. So they basically want, in their mind, what would be the best of all worlds. So let us leave the agreement that we've been sort of engaged in for the last 30 years. Let us leave that agreement, and we want to take all the best parts of the agreement, but none of the bad ones. We want the divorce, so to speak, and we want to keep all the goodies, but we don't want the marital fidelity, right? That's basically what they're saying, right? So this is kind of what they're trying to do. And essentially, Europe has said, we're not going to give you that. We're not going to give you all the benefits and none of the cost. And you really need to understand why Europe is holding out and basically telling Great Britain, you can't have the benefits of free trade without the cost of the free movement of people. You see, if Europe agreed to the deal that the Brexiteers want, the leavers want, the entire Eurozone would unravel very quickly. The entire Eurozone would unravel very quickly, and here's why. France basically says, if you'll give that deal to Great Britain, we want it for us. The Netherlands says, if you give the good deal to Britain, basically the free trade without the free movement of people, well, we want that deal too. So everybody who's rich in the European Union would say, yeah, we want out. We want that deal too. So they can't do it. Basically, in order to hold the Eurozone together, they can't give Britain a good deal. That's really what it comes down to, or at least give Great Britain the deal that they want. That's essentially it, because you have to understand something. The European Union and the Eurozone is not about economics. Please hear me about that. You will not understand at all what is going on over there if you're thinking this is all about economics and it's all about a shared currency. You've got to remember that a shared currency, the Eurozone, was just one step along the road to the ultimate goal, which was political union. Now, why would the Europeans have ever wanted political union? Why would they have wanted it? Well, take yourself back to 1946. 1946, the aftermath of the Second World War, when the Eurozone and the European Union, the whole idea of it was developed. What was their intention? Why all this economic union? Why political union? Well, the whole point of all of it was to constrain Germany, to basically tie down what had always been the strongest region in Europe, and also, do not forget, to bind together so that they could collectively protect themselves from a belligerent Russia that had always been a threat. This was the point, to constrain Germany and to protect themselves from a belligerent Russia. And if you don't understand that, you will never understand the Eurozone. Now, why is the Eurozone struggling so badly? Why is it on the verge of tearing apart at this point? Well, I actually believe it's because the people who remember the source, the point of its origins, they're dying out. The generation that remembers the Second World War, the generation who remembers what a threat Germany can be, the generation who remembers that the Soviet Union on their eastern flank is actually quite belligerent, that generation is dying out. And that's why there needs to be some sort of reevaluation of the Eurozone and its future. But Brexit, I believe, could be the beginning of what may be a long and painful divorce for the entire European Union. But the French and the Germans are saying right now, we're not going to give Great Britain a good deal because if we do, the whole thing unravels very, very quickly. So that being said, what's likely to happen? Well, it can go one of two ways, because there's a firm deadline of March 29th. It can go one of two ways. Deal on Brexit or no deal. There's either going to be a deal or no deal. It's really as simple as that. I'm betting on a deal, and here's why. I'm betting on a last-minute deal, and here's why. This thing reminds me a lot of Y2K. Do you remember Y2K? Remember the 2000, right? Okay, all the people giggling are the people who still have the generator in their basement, right? They still got the bottled water and they stored up food, right? Who went to the ATM and took out cash right before? Because we're not going to be able to get to our ATM. Remember Y2K? Remember all the preparations that your institution had to go through in 1998 and 1999 to get ready for Y2K. So we're all sitting there collectively and we wake up on January 1st, 2000, and what happened? Absolutely nothing. Because you see, if I leave you with nothing, I want you to remember this. The disasters that you can see coming in slow motion are not the ones you need to worry about. The disasters that you see unfolding, like Brexit, kind of in slow motion, the ones you can see, those are never the ones that are going to cause massive economic disruptions. You could see Y2K coming, and so what did we all do? We spent gobs of money preparing for it, and lo and behold, you get to January 1st, and it's all okay. I do believe that this looks very much like Y2K. They'll get right down to the last minute, but unless everybody has really collectively lost their minds, and quite frankly, in the world we live in, I'm not going to totally discount that possibility, that we're not dealing with rational actors any longer. But let's just suppose we don't have rational actors, right? Then we do get this chaotic. But if everyone just sort of suddenly becomes rational, right before, then suddenly you get a deal and it's all fine. which I want to give you just at this point a little side on monetary policy. And you're thinking, well, how can Brexit be related to U.S. monetary policy? Well, it has to do with the fact that what is happening with U.S. monetary policy right now, this movement to normalize monetary policy, is completely expected. So when I look at what the forces that are dragging down the stock market right now, when I look at the forces that are moving exchange rates, it is the things that are unexpected that are working on the economy right now, not the completely expected normalization of monetary policy, the 4 interest rate increases that were very well telegraphed throughout all of last year, in addition to the unwinding of the Federal Reserve's balance sheets, the plan of which has been on the books ever since quantitative easing really got underway. So one of the things that marks modern monetary policy is its sort of role in telegraphing itself, its transparency, to sort of use a word that was on the stage earlier, that one of the things that the Federal Reserve today does is it's very transparent about how it's going to unravel the policies it puts in place and unwind them. And because it does that, it essentially has almost no effect on the economy. It's only the surprises that have an effect on the economy. Now, I am a little concerned about the shape of the yield curve right now. I'm a little concerned about the shape of the yield curve right now, but not so much on the very long end, on the 30-year. I'm more concerned about the differential between 2 years and 5 years. You see, the yield curve looks a little wonky right now. It's not inverted. Instead, it's kind of got this little dip in it, right? It's got this weird little dip in it. And I think the market is signaling to the Federal Reserve, you've done enough up until this point. There are disruptive factors at work, the ones that I'm talking about right now, that I believe will keep the Federal Reserve from raising rates until the second half of next year. So if you're sort of looking for, I'm not much of a forecaster with models, right? But if you're looking for where do I think interest rates are headed, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, and I'll reiterate it later, that because of the shape of the yield curve, because of the behavior of financial markets and the weakness there, and because of all the disruptions that I'm talking to you about right now, I think the Federal Reserve goes on hold until the second half of the year when some of these disruptions settle down after that March 29th deadline and we sort of see what happens worldwide. So, my little aside on monetary policy, because you can't say the word, in front of bankers, you can't not use the word quantitative easing, right? It's a drinking game at our house, just so you know. Every time I say quantitative easing, everybody takes a drink. So if we were doing a dinner speech, we'd do it like that too. If you had wine, I say quantitative easing, you take a drink, right? So not as exciting as it used to be. But we find ourselves in this world where because monetary policy is normalizing, because the Fed is rolling off every single month $50 billion worth of securities. That's significant. That's a lot of paper rolling onto the market over the next couple of years. But because it has been perfectly telegraphed, and they're simply doing what they said they were going to do, I don't really expect it to have any effect on markets whatsoever. Because it's the disruptions you don't see coming that tend to have effects on markets, not the ones that you do. So, that gets me to the second disruption that I don't think most of us saw coming, and that was the current government shutdown. Now, let me just say, there have been 18 government shutdowns since 1976. 18 government shutdowns since I was in kindergarten. So just kind of do the math, right? And so it's not as if government shutdowns are unusual. They tend to be relatively short-lived. And in the last 25 years, there have only been 3 significant ones, this one included. In the last 25 years, there was the one in 1996. Remember, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich is the new Speaker of the House. He comes in and says, I have a contract with America, and I'm not going to accept that budget that you think, we ought to go with. And so that pretty significant shutdown in 1996, it was the longest on record. All right, so it went on for 22 days. We're about to overtake that here pretty soon. And like I said, I checked before I got up here. Is it over yet? Don't look at your smartphones, actually. Just keep your eyes on me, right? So basically, 1996 was pretty significant. There was another one in 2013 around the Affordable Care Act and the disagreement with the new Republican Congress about the Affordable Care Act. That one went on for, I believe, 22 days, something like that, or maybe 18 days with that one. But that was significant in the economic impacts it had on the economy. And we got some sense of how modern shutdowns affect the U.S. economy. And Standard & Poor's has estimated that for every week the government is shut down, it costs $6.5 billion. Take that number in. $6.5 billion a week for every week that the government is shut down. So you have government workers who don't get paid, right? I mean, they'll get paid after the fact, but they can't make their mortgages right now, right? So you have a spillover to consumer spending and consumer sentiment. You have consumers all over America, people who are going, you know what, I'm just going to wait and see. I'm not going to spend money right now because who knows how long this thing could last. So you get cost to the tune of about $6 billion. And I think Rand Paul said it best, and I never thought I would say those words, right? But Rand Paul really said it best when he said it during the last shutdown, it costs more to close the government than it does to keep it open. It costs more to close the government down than it does to keep it open. Now, if you ask me what would be a really sensible thing to do, it really isn't the TSA workers that shouldn't be paid and the border security that shouldn't be paid. I honestly think you shouldn't pay the president and Congress until they come up with some sort of agreement, right? I mean, how is it that they're still getting paid? I just am wondering, and I think that's sort of politically agnostic, right? No matter where you sit across the aisle, how come those guys are collecting a paycheck and the guy who's keeping me safe at the airport isn't? How's that work exactly? So you can imagine, from an economic point of view, it makes no sense to hold the normal operations of government hostage to political posturing on either side. I say that politically agnostically. Now, that being said, I do want to give you my economic sort of perspective on the issue of immigration, which is the sticking point, the issue right now that is in place. Now, I always back up from audiences a little bit because I'm pretty sort of out on the edge on this one. But I'm just going to sort of tell you up front that essentially net migration from Mexico has been negative since 2006. What that means is from Mexico, immigration peaked from Mexico in 2000. In 2000, that was when it peaked. It began to decline. The numbers went down. And by 2006, net migration was negative. What that means is more people from Mexico were leaving the United States, documented, undocumented, whatever, leaving the United States than are actually coming. So I want you to hold that statistic in your head and understand that net migration from Mexico is already negative, meaning no matter what we're doing, no matter what kind of policies we have in place, they're already net returning to Mexico faster than they're coming. So keep that in mind. Now, you need to understand that because it's important to understand what are the forces that drive immigration. What are the forces that drive immigration? Well, first of all, who immigrates? Old people or young people? We all know, right? It's young people. So there's a huge demographic component to immigration. And anytime you put a rich country up against a poor country, and you have a baby boom in the poor country, you're going to see net migration flows. I don't care how big of a wall you build. It won't matter if you put a rich country up against a poor country and you have a big demographic boom in the poor country. You get a lot of young people. Now, what happens as that demographic boom rolls off and the population returns to normal? The migration stops. That's essentially what happens. So Mexico had their big baby boom about 20 years after the United States of America. Basically what happened is it took a little longer for birth control to get to Mexico. That's it, right? So we had this big baby boom in the United States that we're all aware of, but what we don't realize is that Mexico had one too. It was just 20 years later. So you put Mexico, a poor country, up against a rich country. You put into place NAFTA, which essentially gave the U.S. corn industry equal footing with the Mexican corn industry for the first time ever. Mexican corn farmers couldn't compete with U.S. corn farmers. So what happens to the corn industry in Mexico at that point? Well, it simply goes away, and Mexico starts importing all their corn, and they use a lot of it, from the United States of America. So there's no jobs for all those corn farmers in Mexico, so what do? Well, they just start walking north, right? They keep going past Mexico City, and they end up in the United States, right? So suddenly you have big boom in immigration into the United States that peaks in 2000 from Mexico. But as soon as the demographic wave comes off, it's over with. So why and where are the immigrants coming from now? They're not coming from Mexico. Where are they coming from? They're coming from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Any guesses what the demographics of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala look like? Well, they too had a baby boom, and it was 10 years after Mexico's. So what happens in the next 5 years to immigration naturally from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador? It just tapers off, just like Mexico. So if you do build that wall, it's just going to be keeping people in. Do you get that? They're going to be going out the other direction, right? I mean, it's complete nonsense, totally, if you just look at the facts around immigration. Completely. So keep that in mind, regardless of where you sit on the issue around legal, illegal, undocumented, documented. The reality is that the demographics aren't there to support further immigration. If you think your dairy industry in this state has labor problems now, give it 5 more years. Give it 5 more years. If you think it's bad now, give it 5 more years. The smartest thing you could do, because I thought to myself, how many people live in Honduras? It's less than 10 million. Why don't we all give them a first-class plane ticket to Wisconsin, right? But you got to work in a dairy farm, right? I mean, that's just the rules, right? You can come, sell them a visa, right? That would be my chant, right? Because I'm an economist. Not build that wall, but how about sell that visa? Sell that visa, right? Just start selling them. Selling them, tax them, make it temporary, right? I mean, those are sensible economic solutions. Sensible economic solutions, but, there doesn't seem to be too much of a market for that in too many places, except hopefully in Wisconsin. So, that's my sort of perspective on the shutdown. Fortunately, if history is any guide, these things go on for about 3 weeks. And once government workers miss a couple of payments, once those TSA people, right, the ones who I'm going to depend on when I go to the airport here in just a few hours, once they all go and get other jobs, because the unemployment rate in this country is 3.7%, so it's not going to be hard for them to get new jobs, they're going to start walking off, and you're going to have serious labor shortages in critical areas of our economy. That's going to put the pressure on everybody. Now, I'm not particularly fond of the idea of using an executive order to get funding for the wall. Not because I don't like the wall, but that I had a problem when the prior administration used executive orders to circumvent Congress, and I don't like it when this administration does it as well. I don't like it when any executive uses executive orders because they can't seem to find a compromise with the Congress. That's a system of political dysfunction, and that's something that I think as Americans across the board, regardless of where you sit on these issues, you need to think about that as a way that's a symbol of our dysfunction as well, and it's not the way to go. But it's the most likely solution, quite frankly. So that gets us to the third and most important source of disruption, because I think Brexit is causing international disruptions. They're not all that important for you day in and day out. The shutdown is a temporary disruption. I expect it to be over in a week, maybe 2. But then there's this third one that seems to be dragging on much longer than I ever expected. Now, if you know me at all, or even if you've only known me for the last 20 minutes, it won't surprise you to hear me say that I do not like to admit when I am wrong. I do not do it very often. Just ask my husband. But I was wrong about the trade war. I thought it'd be over quickly. I really did. I thought, they'll find a way to save face, they'll cut a deal, and everybody will go home. Because everybody knows that the trade relations that we have developed with China over the last 20 years since China joined the WTO have not only contributed to significant growth and improvement in China, which personally I care about, because if you care about global development at all, what you will sort of know is that the number of people who are living on less than $2 a day, which is one of the standards for global economic development, has declined dramatically in the last 20 years. That's something that sort of the World Bank sort of touts as being a sort of a sign that the world is a better place because there are fewer people living on less than $2 a day. The sad news is that most of that improvement has come from one country, China. That the most of it has come from one country, and that is China. And so economic development and the trade that we have developed and the movement of China into the global supply chain has clearly benefited China dramatically. But it's also benefited the United States of America as well. And I want to be totally clear that China is not a developed country. Their GDP per person is still lower than Mexico's. Hear me. China's GDP per person, if you stack up countries' GDP per person, their GDP per person is less than Mexico. Hard to believe, right? We all are like, oh, Mexico's the poor country. No, China's the poor country too. They're also a very poor country. If you line them up that way, this idea that they rival the United States in terms of economic growth and power is nonsense. It's real nonsense. Because while their economy may be close to the same size as ours when you measure the whole thing, how many more people do they have than the United States of America? 3 times as many. 3 times as many. So for our economies to be on par, the Chinese economy would have to be 3 times larger than the U.S. For their economy to look like ours looks when you look out the window or look anywhere, their economy would have to be 3 times bigger than ours. That's why their GDP per person is still less than Mexico. So they are still a very poor country. Now, trade has clearly benefited their economy, but it's benefited ours as well. I hope I do not have to make the case for free trade to this group. I hope I don't have to. But I will say this. Whenever there is a trade war, what I really wanted to get to was, what's the objective? What's the administration's objectives? And I do think that the stated objectives are 2. If you look and sort of pick through, and there have been a lot of articles written about this whole thing because it's been going on for a year, there seem to be 2 main objectives that we're trying to get some agreement on. I think the first objective of improving the transfer of technology conditions and protecting intellectual property, though that's a legitimate beef with the Chinese government. It is. But it's a beef that needs to be settled at the WTO. The beef with the Chinese over technology transfers and intellectual property protection, that really should be settled at the WTO, not with the trade war. Now you can say to yourselves, well, the WTO hadn't done anything about it so far. And the response is, that is correct, but here's why. When China entered the WTO in 2000, no one imagined how important they would become in the grand scheme of things. China didn't matter in 2000 the way it matters in 2018. So I think the organization as an institution, when China was sort of violating the rules, they kind of looked the other way here and there because they were small, they were developing. They still, by the way, are a very poor country. And so we kind of give those countries passes here and there. But then it became a habit, and now it's a real problem. And it really needs to be at the WTO level that we force this to be fixed. Doing it as a trade war costs money for everyone. How much money? Well, let's talk about it. The first element of the trade war was in January of last year, when the administration announced that there would be a tariff on solar panels and washing machines. That was the very beginning of all this, back in January. Solar panels and washing machines. Now, who cares about solar panels, right? What's the big deal? Who buys solar panels, by the way? Rich people in California, okay? So why not punish them, right? So you get tariffs on solar panels and washing machines. How often does anybody buy a washing machine? Every 5-6 years, so nobody's going to notice the tariff on washing machines. What's it going to matter? But then as the year went on, in March, 25% tariff on steel, 10% tariff on aluminum. The Chinese start to retaliate as time goes on. And suddenly we find ourselves all the way here in the summer of 2018, And half the trade between the U.S. and China is now under a 10% tariff. And if we don't settle things by March, again, March seems to be kind of the month to watch. If we don't settle things, the tariff goes to 25%. Now, a 10% tariff we can all live with. I mean, that's kind of a little sand in the gears of commerce. But what about a 25% tariff? No, things start to get really, really serious. And you start to realize that the first goal that I talked about of sort of improving the terms of trade around the transfer of technologies and intellectual property, that's one goal. But the administration's second goal, the one that I think they're actually after, is to shrink the trade deficit. That's really their goal. Their real goal is to shrink the trade deficit by half. Now, who does that benefit exactly? No one. Let me be really clear. That benefits no one. And here's why. If I shrink the trade deficit with China, what does that mean? Well, you have to ask yourself, why do we have a trade deficit with China? Why do we have a trade deficit with China? Because it basically means our imports exceed our exports when it comes to goods. If you put services in there, the trade deficit shrinks pretty much. But it just means we import more than we export. Now, if I say, well, why do we have a trade deficit with China? You go, oh, it's because they make so much cheap stuff. That does not answer the question of why we have a trade deficit with China. Because they make cheap stuff for everybody, but is Cuba running a trade deficit with China? Is sub-Saharan Africa running a trade deficit with China? Maybe small ones, but not the ones like we have. Why do we run a trade deficit with China? Why do we buy so much from them? Why do we buy so much from them that we fill up every closet in our house, then our garage, then we have to go get a storage facility because the garage is full because we bought so much from China? Why do we buy so much from them? Because we are rich. Because we can. The reason we run a trade deficit is because we can. And here's how I discovered this. In my first job, I was an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And I worked directly for the bank president, Bob McTeer. And one of the things I put together from him is something called strengths and weaknesses. And he used it for his FOMC meetings. And here's all it was. It was simply columns of data. And if it improved, it was a strength. And if it weakened, it was a weakness. And it was his cheat sheet to see where he thought the economy was headed. Were things getting better or were things getting worse? And it was pretty good in terms of just getting a quick and dirty read on the economy. So I'm a new economist. I'm responsible for putting together the strengths and weaknesses. And I come in and hand him the document. He looks over it really quickly and he goes, imports increased. And you put that as a weakness. And I said, yeah, because if imports go up, that means our trade deficit gets bigger, and that's a weakness for the economy. And he goes, no, it's not. That's wrong. He said, if imports increase, it's because Americans are spending more because they feel more confident and they're wealthier and their incomes are going up. So higher imports are actually a strength for the economy. And I've thought about it correctly ever since, that higher imports are a strength for the economy, not a weakness. And so when does the trade deficit tend to shrink? Does anybody know? During a recession. That's exactly right. Trade deficits shrink naturally during a recession, so maybe the plan all along is to just engineer a recession in the U.S. economy so our trade deficit will shrink. So the goal in and of itself is it makes no economic sense to shrink the trade deficit. And you can say, well, but what about our manufacturing sector? Well, I can ask you this. What happens to manufacturing output in the United States of America every single year? Does it go up or down? It goes up every single year, unless there's a recession. But pretty much manufacturing output goes up every single year. Now, what about employment as a percentage of the population in manufacturing? Oh, it's been dropping. But my friends, it's been dropping since 1980, since I was in middle school. It doesn't have anything to do with China. It has to do with capitalism. It has to do with the capitalization, not the labor, but the capital in manufacturing. That it's become more capital intensive over time, just like agriculture, right? Agriculture used to be the #1 employer in the United States of America until the combine was invented, right? And then that was it. tractors brought an end to that. Now, every year, what happens to the output of wheat, rice, grain, soybeans of any kind in this country? Well, it goes up. We just don't employ people there. Same thing with manufacturing. It's just not your employment base. Well, you can say, well, those are the good jobs. Well, they are, but there's other good jobs too. And standing in the way of the creative disruption that I talked about earlier, well, we all know that countries have tried to do that, and it never goes down well for them. The single biggest threat right now to the global economy is this trade war weakens China terribly. That's really the problem, because China is a big customer of ours. They purchase 25% of the soybean crop in America. You don't want to weaken them. And you may say to yourself, well, but if we weaken them, they'll give in. And I'm thinking to myself, well, let's see. If they give in and we actually do shrink the trade deficit, well, that's bad for me and for you and every person in this room. So that's what winning means under these circumstances. So we win, we lose. But here's the deal. I don't think China gives in that easily. Well, you could say, but, you know, they've got to respond to their voters, right? Right? Got any Vietnam vets in the room? Anybody here? Anybody remember Vietnam, right? Few people in here remember Vietnam, right? Do the Chinese give in easily? No, they don't respond to their voters. No, I think that's the reality. So if we were bargaining and negotiating with a similar negotiating partner, maybe we'd get somewhere. But even if you don't think the goal is ridiculous, even though the goal is economically ridiculous, I don't think we get anywhere. And this thing continues to drag on at least until March, when things really get serious and the tariff goes to 25%. So at the end of the day, I hope you've sort of said and sort of realized that I think the first quarter of this year is very disruptive. Shutdown, Brexit, uncertainty around the tariffs. If I could advise you to do anything, it would be to turn your smartphone off until March 29th. Just turn it off. Don't look. Don't look at your statements. I mean, you really can't do that. But essentially what's going to happen is your blood pressure is going to be elevated for the next 2.5 months. It's not going to feel good. But remember that those March deadlines are looming and that rational actors bump up against those March deadlines, and suddenly I think the year opens up in the next 3 quarters to be something much more pleasant, much more normal, much more sort of an economy boosted by tax cuts. Let's not forget about that. An economy that's ultimately supported by the things that matter, which is a strong business community, right? Institutions that can and do work, even in the face of a lot of stresses, right? And fundamental economic strength that hasn't gone away despite the man-made disruptions that we're living with today. So, with those thoughts in mind, why don't we go ahead, open up the floor to questions. I think we have time for a couple, and we'll see sort of what's on everybody else's mind.
So raise your hands. Raise your hands if you have a question. We have a couple of veteran helpers in the back who can come to you with a microphone. So let me just get things started. So sounds like you're optimistic we're not going to have a recession.
Yes, I am optimistic that we don't have a recession, that I believe the trend rate of growth in the economy right now is probably about 3.5%. I think the tax cuts took the trend rate of growth up to about 3.5%. I think this shutdown, every day of it, sort of eats into that 3.5% in the first quarter. And so you're probably going to get a first quarter that comes in weaker than everybody expects. And Brexit as well is affecting companies globally. And the trade war is affecting companies like Apple. And so the first quarter, I would say, I could even imagine like a 1.8%. I think we're going to be very disappointed with the GDP numbers in the first quarter. And then I think we go back to 3.5%. But a recession would require us to drop 3.5%. I don't see that happening. These things are not the kind of things that make for a 3.5% decline. You would need some sort of problem in a real sector of the economy, like real estate, right? And so because this is not sort of real estate slowdown or anything like that, I think it'll look much more like a slowdown rather than a recession. But great question.
Okay, any other questions? Please raise your hands if you have a question. There, over here.
Sure. Talk about the yield
Talk
curve.
about the yield curve. He didn't need the helpers, so he could shout it out.
That's
Talk
okay,
about the
yeah.
yield curve.
Talk about the yield curve. Okay, so I've been watching the yield curve very closely over the last couple of months, right? Because we know it's sort of threatening with this negative territory, and we all know, sort of being in the industry, that anytime the yield curve has gone negative in the past, yeah, you get a recession 6 months later. Typically, that's kind of the rule of thumb, right? So yield curves predict recessions, or yield curve inversion predicts recessions. And that was true prior to 2000. But now that now that there's no supply of 30-year treasuries, I believe that the intervention in those markets and the Fed sort of artificially holding down long-term rates through quantitative easing has changed the predictive power of the yield curve. So the yield curve before, didn't have this sort of artificial intervention on the long end, right? No artificial restrictions in supply or anything like that. And so, and artificially pumped up demand for long-term yields, or supply of long-term yields. So this sort of intervention in the market, I think, is put a lot of noise into the signals around the yield curve, if that's helpful. Right? So I don't think it sends the kind of signal that we were all accustomed to in the 80s and in the 90s. So while I don't want to ignore it, I don't want to give it the predictive power that it used to, because you've got all of this artificial stuff going on out on the long end.
Right here, Shel Lubar has a question.
What happens to your forecast if the lady in Great Britain decides to have a new vote?
Sure.
Well,
I can answer.
let me repeat it.
Sure.
Sure, let me repeat the question. So the question is, what happens if there's a new Brexit vote?
Sure. What happens if Theresa May actually does call for a new Brexit vote? Well, I think actually calling for a new Brexit vote, the idea is they would probably have to do it in 2 stages. So that was really the problem. They said leave or don't leave, and everybody went leave, not knowing what the leave would actually look like. So if they did do another vote, they would probably almost have to do it in 2 stages, where in the first stage they would say, if we left, do you want it to look like this or do you want it to look like this, right? So to give people some sense of what does leaving really look like, right? And then they would back up and say, okay, now that we voted for if we leave, it looks like this, right? It's either Theresa May's plan or it's a hard Brexit and there's no Irish backstop and we just completely shut the thing off, right? So giving people sort of that choice first and then backing up and saying, okay, now that you voted for a hard Brexit, do you really want to do that, right? Yeah, well, I think you're hitting on something. And let me say, hitting on something, he said, I'm assuming that now, knowing what they know, they would vote not to leave, right? And I think that kind of gets a little bit to the politics of modern elections in modern economies. One of the things that we know is that young people don't vote at the same rate that older folks do. And that when you look at Brexit, who were the primary beneficiaries of an open economy? Not retirees and pensioners, because quite frankly, they're legally bound to get their checks no matter what. So they've enjoyed all of their working lives, the benefits of Brexit and the benefits of being in the union, the benefits of being to go back and forth and travel and do all those things that they've enjoyed for 30 years. And now they want to retire to Brighton Beach, right? They want to retire to Brighton and say, now that I've enjoyed all those things my whole life, and now that I'm in my 70s and 80s, let me close myself to the world. I don't want to deal with foreigners, and I think it'd be better for Great Britain economically if we didn't do this. So those folks all got out and voted. And the young people, I guess, were playing video games. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what they were doing, but they didn't get out and vote. The main people who are beneficiaries of an open economy, which is young people, are basically sitting the elections out. And so I think this is problematic, not just for Great Britain, because I think you're right, that if they held the vote today, they'd put down their Game Boys or whatever they play with now, right? They would put that down and they would actually get out there and make their voices heard. And so I think there's a part of it is that getting younger people more actively involved in politics is key to bringing us back together. And I'm not pointing the finger at older people, I'm actually pointing the finger at the younger people. Don't be angry at the outcome if you didn't get to the ballot box. And I know from the numbers that they're not getting to the ballot box. We have to figure out a way that that's part of our division. Now, you may say to yourself, I'm glad those liberal kids don't vote. You might say to yourself that, but that is a cynicism that I am not willing to accept in the United States of America. I just won't accept it. Even if I don't like your ideas, I want everybody to feel like they're fully participating in the outcome, because when they don't, that's when the political dysfunction happens. And that's when it's problematic, even if I don't like their ideas. And many of them I don't. But I still want them to be invested in the outcome, because I think that's when politics works best.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good tone to end on. So thanks very much, Marcy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. So we're going to wrap up a little bit early today, but you have time to network a little bit more. Before we go, I want to thank Governor Tony Evers, of course, Marcy Rossel, Shel Lubar, thanks very much, and all our sponsors. Of course, the team, Rose and her team from the Wisconsin Bankers Association put on another great show. Construction Business Group, the Wisconsin Building Trades Council, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, the Wisconsin Transportation Builders Association, Associated Bank, BOK Financial Institutional Advisors, Bankonomics, Bankers Bank, Boardman and Clark, News Talk 1310 WIBA, and WisBusiness.com. So we'll see you all next January right here. Thanks very much, everybody.